Windows Me, the operating system that everyone just loves to hate. Yes, today we're going to be talking all about the version of Windows that many consider to be the worst of all time. It was released only a year after Windows 2000, and was the very last version of Windows to be built on top of MS-DOS, before Microsoft completely moved on from the 9X kernel with the release of Windows XP in 2001. This also makes Windows Me one of the shortest lived releases of Windows ever, as it took only a year for it to be superseded. But despite its reputation, it did bring some welcomed improvements to Windows. It incorporated a lot of the visual elements introduced with Windows 2000, and even introduced new features like System Restore, something that is still included with modern versions of Windows today. It had high hopes of being a viable successor to its predecessor, Windows 98 2nd Edition, but over the years it's been the subject of endless criticism, garnering it the name Mistake Edition, and is widely considered to be one of Microsoft's biggest failures. But is this reputation deserved? And if so, what went wrong with Windows Me? In today's video, we're going to take a look at the development process behind the infamous operating system. I'll be taking you through 4 development builds, each one compiled at a different stage in the development process, highlighting some of the major changes that occurred over the years. Let's get started. We don't have to go very far back in time to discover the origins of Windows Me, as its development began just over a year before its final release. In fact, the operating system was initially not going to even exist. In 1998, Bill Gates announced that Windows 98 was going to be the last release of Windows built on top of MS-DOS. Microsoft had already been using the NT kernel for their business line of operating systems for years, and wanted to bring that technology over to the consumer side of things. But the company later reversed this decision by releasing Windows 98 2nd Edition in 1999. Although this isn't really considered to be an entirely new version of Windows, but more of a set of updates for Windows 98. But that same year, Microsoft announced their intentions to create one more release of Windows based on the 9X kernel, and it was eventually given the codename Windows Millennium. Now, Microsoft had a lot going on around this time. Windows Neptune and Odyssey were also being worked on, both intended to be the next major releases of Windows. Odyssey was planned to supersede Windows 2000, and Neptune was slated to be the first consumer release of Windows based on NT. Both of these projects would eventually be merged to create Whistler, which I talk more about in my Windows XP development history video. But it's important to mention Neptune, because the developers of Windows Millennium initially wanted to incorporate some of its features, and these efforts can be seen in some of the early development builds. So let's talk about them. We're going to start off with the earliest known build of Windows Me, 2332.2, which is a pre-beta build compiled on July 13, 1999. This was only 2 months after the release of Windows 98 2nd Edition, but we can see in the initial setup that most of the branding has been changed to say Windows Millennium, the codename for the operating system. This is one of the few releases of Windows whose final release name is the same as its codename, at least close enough. Even though it was released as Windows Me, the ME was an acronym that stood for Millennium Edition, as seen in the final release's setup screen. And yes, Microsoft intended for the ME in Windows Me to be pronounced just like the word, me, as evident in their advertising and marketing campaigns from that time. The design of the setup largely resembles Windows 98, even in the final release, and as such we won't see many other changes here. After the first phase of setup finishes, we'll be presented with the new boot screen, identifying the OS as a developer release of Windows Millennium. Upon logging in, you'll see the build string at the bottom right, and the new icons from Windows 2000, which have already been implemented. And this was one of the major visual changes made in Windows Me, taking a lot of the Windows 2000 visual elements and bringing them over to the consumer side of things. There are also some branding changes made to certain about boxes, but the system still identifies itself as Windows 98 in some places. But visual changes were not the only changes. As I mentioned earlier, there are actually a few builds of Millennium that contain some files from Windows Neptune, and this is one of them. However, it only contains some system files, not any functional features like the activity centers. Let's move on to build 2348, another pre-beta build compiled about a month after 2332.2. This build contains some new features, but we won't see them until after the OS has been installed, as the setup screens have remained unchanged. The boot screen also still identifies the build as a developer release. Two major features introduced in this build are System Restore and System File Protection, both of which can be enabled by modifying keys in the Windows registry. System Restore allows users to revert their system back to a previous point in time in the event of any problems. It would become a signature feature of Windows Me. The files for this application are located in C Windows System Restore, but running the executable just results in a PC health error. Interestingly enough, there's an additional survey button on error messages that doesn't do anything in this build. Also included in this folder is a README document. It makes reference to batch files stored on a network share, presumably on an internal Microsoft network. The two other executables don't launch System Restore either, as the feature is non-functional in this build. A Beta 1 build, 2394, contains the first fully working implementation of System Restore. We've also got System File Protection. This is another extremely useful feature that is easily forgotten about, as it runs in the background without any user input. In the event that any critical system files are removed from the system, Windows Me could restore them using a cached copy. The feature was also seen in Windows XP and 2000, just known as Windows File Protection. Now, that System Restore error made reference to a program called PC Health, which is working in this build. You can specify a problem, and the program would provide a link to the necessary troubleshooter, which is contained in the Help application. It asks you for a more specific description of the problem you're having, and gives you tips on how to fix it. And if that doesn't resolve the problem, the last step allows you to get help from a support engineer, who would look over the information you submitted and send you an email with info on a possible fix. It reminds me of the remote assistance feature that we would see in Windows XP, just through email with a Microsoft representative. But we're not done yet, because there is another feature seen in this build that would not be seen in a final release of Windows at all: the activity centers. Yes, those activity centers, the ones from Microsoft Neptune. You're able to get access to them in this build, similar to how you do so in Neptune build 5111. However, you have to add a dword value to a registry key first before running a reg svr32 command. The files are stored in the same directory, and the UI has a bit of a different design along with Windows Millennium branding. But this branding was also seen in the Neptune version of the activity centers, which indicates that certain components could have been shared between the two development teams. And keep in mind, this build was compiled about 4 months before Neptune build 5111. The interface is not fully functional though, as many of the links are broken or non-existent. Eventually, the activity centers were dropped, as Microsoft shifted their focus for both the Millennium and Neptune projects. Neptune was merged with Odyssey to form the Whistler project sometime later on, and it was decided that Windows Me would serve more as an intermediary release by simply improving upon Windows 98 instead of drastically changing the user interface with something like the activity centers. Let's jump ahead to January of 2000, when Windows Millennium build 2452 was compiled. This is a Beta 2 build which introduces some more visual modifications. It also changes the name of the folder where setup files are stored on the CD from Win9x to WinMe. While the initial portion of setup looks exactly the same, it does update the text blurbs to make mention of some of Windows Me's new features, including Movie Maker. The second phase gets a new background that would not be seen in the final release. The boot screen retains the same design, but loses the developer release branding, making for a more minimal look. There has also been a change in WinVer, as the system now identifies itself as simply Windows, but other about boxes and the system properties panel retain the Millennium branding. But there is some branding that still says Windows 98, like in the Welcome program, which has remained unchanged, although it is not set to start automatically at login. The survey button on error messages is still here as well, but actually works now. This brings up a feedback panel when clicked. Here, the user can submit feedback to the developers if the error message is too vague or maybe not necessary. This is similar to the comments button seen in Neptune and Whistler builds. Opening up the start menu and going into the games folder reveals the inclusion of the Internet games, which would be formally introduced in Windows Me. System Restore also gets a new design, looking much closer to the final implementation. This build also contains an early version of Windows Movie Maker, specifically build 1200. It's certainly not complete, as there definitely are some bugs, but Movie Maker, along with the inclusion of Windows Media Player 7 and the Internet Games, helped shape Windows Me as a digital media-focused release of the operating system. Now we've got one more build to take a look at, but before we get to it, I want to briefly tell you about today's video sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is the online learning community that gives you the tools to boost your creative skills through interactive video lessons. Whether you're wanting to learn a new skill or brush up on a topic that you already know, I'd recommend checking out their wide range of classes on productivity, creative writing, and video editing, just to name a few topics. But that doesn't even scratch the surface of what Skillshare has to offer. Maybe you're thinking of getting into video editing, and if so, check out this Skillshare class from Sean Dykink that gives some great tips on creating visually appealing video projects. You'll even be able to download the assets used in the video lessons, so that you can follow along and maybe get creative with your own edits. Most of these classes are under an hour in length and are split up into multiple sections for more convenient viewing. And since Skillshare is a learning community, you can chat with other users taking the same class and read feedback from people who have already finished it. With Skillshare's premium plan, you'll get access to every class on the platform, and it's less than $10 per month if billed annually. But today, Skillshare is offering the first 1,000 people who click the link in this video's description a free 2-month trial of their premium plan. So if you're interested, head on over to Skillshare today and start learning. Our last build to discuss in this video is 2525.6. This is the official release candidate 1 build that was compiled in May of 2000. By this time, most visual elements and interfaces have been finalized, as we're only a couple of months away from the release to manufacturing. We can first see this in the setup process, where the system now identifies itself as Windows Millennium Edition. All of the artwork and text blurbs during setup have been completed as well. The final boot screen is present, along with the second phase setup design. The largest change by far is the new welcome video that is seen upon first login. It's not the same as the one in the final release, but once it's finished, it will take you to an interactive media application where you can learn more about some of Windows Me's features. And since this is the RC1 build, the new branding has taken effect system-wide, and the OS is looking rather complete. The final build of Windows Me, Build 3000, was released to manufacturing in June of 2000 and to general availability 3 months later. But was it really the worst operating system of all time, like many have said? Like I showcased in the development builds, Windows Me introduced many useful features that seem to have been forgotten about, like System Restore and System File Protection. And even though they may not be the most visible and exciting things, they serve as extremely useful under-the-hood improvements. On the more visible side, Windows Me introduced the Internet Games, a new version of Media Player, and brought Windows Movie Maker to Windows for the very first time. And keep in mind, all of these features were implemented in just about a year, and I think that on its own is an impressive achievement. But it can be argued that this short development cycle is what set Windows Me up for failure. There were reported compatibility issues with drivers around the time Windows Me launched, and it's logical to say that more time would have allowed these issues to be worked out. However, this requires cooperation between Microsoft and hardware vendors. One of the other problems users had with Windows Me was its removal of Real Mode DOS. This got rid of the Restart in MS-DOS mode option from the shutdown menu, but there was a reason for this. Removing Real DOS mode sped up the system's boot time by allowing the OS to bypass the processing of certain DOS files like config.sys during boot up, which was great. The downside was you lost the ability to restart in MS-DOS mode, so if you relied heavily on DOS-based programs or played a lot of DOS games, this wasn't so great. Now you could run these programs using the DOS prompt within Windows, but it wasn't exactly the same experience. But there is a case for why Microsoft did this beyond just speeding up boot times. I mean, think about it. Windows XP didn't have a real DOS mode either. It was impossible since it was NT based, but we all got used to it. Sure, there were growing pains, no doubt, but NT was the future of Windows, and I think the removal of real mode DOS gave everyone a little push forward. It can be compared to Apple removing the 3.5-inch floppy disk drive from the iMac G3. If you used a lot of floppy disks, it sucked, but it helped to move the industry forward because CDs were the future, and eventually other computer manufacturers did the same. Look, I'm not trying to make a "it took courage" argument, but I think this gives a long-term view as to why Microsoft did this. Obviously, we can't know for sure though. Windows Me absolutely had its problems, and it's easy to see why many users just stuck with 98SE or even chose to upgrade to 2000 instead. Though I think it's fair to say that calling it the worst OS of all time is a bit of an exaggeration. But I want to hear what you think. What was your experience with Windows Me like? Be sure to leave a comment down below. That's going to wrap it up for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed this one. If you did, be sure to give it a like and get subscribed. And as always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.